The discovery of almost 1,000 unmarked graves of Indigenous children at boarding schools in Canada is forcing the continent to take a look at its genocidal past against the Indigenous community. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The recent discovery of unmarked graves belonging to Indigenous children at church-run schools in Canada is sending shockwaves across North America. It also brought global attention to this traumatic chapter in the country's history and unleashed deep-set emotions in those who managed to survive the system. Mark Masterton reports from Mission in British Columbia.
Raymond Mason of the Peguis First Nation in Manitoba was taken from his parents when he was 6. He was one of about 150,000 Indigenous children removed from their families and sent to church-run residential schools for the stated purpose of being assimilated into Canadian society. The practice began in the 1800s and continued well into the 20th century. Despite his turbulent past, Mason has gone on to represent his people in the Canadian House of Commons, as well as writing a book about his experiences as a residential school survivor.
When I first saw and heard about the discovery of the unmarked graves, I got cold chills down my body. Excuse me. And I started to cry. You know, I was crying with joy and crying with sadness. Sadness because these children never had a chance in the world. And I was happy in a way because they have been found.
So far, more than 1,000 unmarked graves have been discovered at sites of former residential schools. The reminders of the past turned this month's traditional Canada Day celebrations into a day of mourning and reflection as protests and memorials were set up across the country. The focus now turns to the Canadian government and what can be done to bridge the gap towards reconciliation of the Indigenous community.
Let's look at the clean water that is not available in all parts of Canada. Let's look at the systemic racism in the institutions that we deal with on a regular basis, such as with the RCMP, such as with the Child and Family Services, such as with the hospital and the healthcare system. And until all of those acknowledgements happen on the institutional level, the world is going to have to push Canada to be accountable for those actions.
In the next few weeks, ground-penetrating technology will be used on the former grounds of St. Mary's Indian Residential School in British Columbia to look for more unmarked graves. The Indigenous community remains hopeful the past can lead to a brighter future for their people and their country.
For the next generation, I am hopeful. We're resilient. I agree that we are very strong people. I agree that we have a voice and we want to speak. That's what I want to project. We have a voice and we're not going to shut up.
Mark Masterton, CGTN, Mission.
Earlier, I spoke with Karen Joseph. She is Chief Executive Officer of Reconciliation China. I started by asking her about these discoveries and how they were kept away from the public eye for so long.
Well, it's all a part of the history of the Indian residential school survivors system that they had in place here in Canada. And the purpose of the schools really was to remove the children, all of our children across the country, away from any influence or connection with any adult person from their culture. And so they were all put into these schools, and which were run by the churches. They were funded by the government, run by the churches. And once they were there, the children often never saw their parents again. And so essentially whatever happened in those environments were beyond the eyes of anybody pretty much, except for the children who were there. And so actually over 50% of the children died within those institutions, and the government knew it and sort of wanted to keep, obviously, those numbers from getting out. And so we're anticipating every school, over 140 will likely find similar unmarked grave sites.
These schools that you talk about, Karen, First Nations leaders call these schools concentration camps, and he said that, or rather the Canadian media says that this is Canada's Holocaust moment.
Yes.
Do you agree with those descriptions?
Yes, actually I do. It's an ongoing genocide. The difference between the Holocaust and here, obviously, is that this is spread out over 100 years. And, still to some degree continues today. A lot of the policies are still in place.
The Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they issued their final report in 2015, and in that report they said that sexual abuse was rampant in these schools. There was also physical abuse in these schools as well. Children were also beaten up for speaking their own language. Up to 4,000 children died, most of them from malnourishment and disease. What can you tell us about conditions in those schools?
Wow, okay. They were actually horrible. As I mentioned, once the children entered into those schools, they were actually architecturally created in order to facilitate this separation. And so you walked into an entryway, basically. There was a front doors, there was a welcoming area or a waiting area, and then there was a second set of doors. And in between those two doors, the children were stripped of their names, and they were given a number once they walked into the door. And so even if a parent tried to come and pick them up, to try to take them back home for summer breaks or whatever it was, they were oftentimes told, "Oh, I'm sorry, there is no child here by that name," because the child's name was taken from them and they were given a number. And so once they went into that place, the abuse began immediately. My father was there for over 11 years, and when he speaks of it, he said within the first 2 weeks he was utterly destroyed. It's more than beatings. There was torture. There were children raped. They were put in cages. There were sort of nutritional research going on to see about the effects of starvation on people, and it was a horrific place. And as I said, the chief medical health officer for the Department of Indian Affairs at the time notified the government that over 50% of these children were dying in these places, that they were certainly no place of any type of education. And what the government did with that information was bury it, and actually shortly thereafter made a law across the country that every child needs to attend these institutions.
These are serious crimes that you're talking about that took place in these schools. Have the Canadian police carried out any kind of investigation, and has anyone been held accountable for them?
Not accountable in the way that one would think. So individuals that participated in that, no, not necessarily. The challenge with having the Canadian police investigate this is that although they didn't have a part in running the schools, they were actually deployed to every community across the country to take the children and transport them to these schools. So to have them investigated is really not acceptable in any way, because they were certainly a huge part of ensuring that those children were removed from their communities, and any parent that tried to resist that was also thrown in jail. So
what is the current situation right now, Karen? Because I looked at one report that said that more than half the children in Canadian foster care are Indigenous, despite the fact that they only make up about 8% of the child population in Canada. Many were taken away from their families. They have no link to their culture. They have no links to their families whatsoever. In fact, a Canadian minister, the minister in charge of Indigenous Affairs says racism in the child welfare system is well documented and systematic. What is going on right now?
It's very much well documented and systematic. So for any other person or culture within Canadian society, in order for a child to be removed, there has to be evidence of abuse or violence against those children. For Indigenous people, however, it has to be, there is a level of neglect that oftentimes is reached, which any person who is who comes from sort of those underserved populations or from the lower economic echelons of our society would fit within that grid. And so they are removed as a result of that rather than as a result of violence, which is why we see so many of our children there. And there are many instances, even after the schools finished, there was the 60 scoop, which was part of the beginning of this, and this removal of children and putting into foster care is not even in Canada, around the world. And the forced sterilization of women and, you know, different things like that. So,
as you say, the racism, the discrimination has been well documented. Could you give us a sense of the kinds of racism that the Indigenous people of Canada face right now?
Well, we still live under the Indian Act, which is actually the document that permits all of this to happen. And so up until, you know, the 60s, we were considered non-persons, and all of our anything that was perceived to be owned was then the responsibility of the government to sort of take care of us. And so we still exist under that document. That document actually is the same document that supported apartheid in South Africa. The South African government came to Canada to understand the Indian Act because they had done so well with the Indian people here in the country. And actually, when Mandela was finally elected, the first place he came to was Canada because he understood that history. The difference between South Africa and Canada, again, are these Indian residential schools. They went even further than the South African government did.
Yes, I remember that visit very well. What kind of impact is this having on the Canadian public, the general public in Canada? There was a recent poll that was done which showed that 57% of Canadians think that the discovery of these remains that were found in these grave sites make them question the entire moral foundation that Canada is based on. I mean, is this a long overdue reckoning for Canadians?
Yes, and I think it's a, you know, the way that I see it is that the unearthing of these children has put Canada on a precipice. And we have the option right now as a country to decide how it is we want to show up in the future, not just for Indigenous children, but for all of our children. And we want to make sure that we're living our values and that, you know, we're all a part of creating society. We have really strong beliefs around our children, and those children being the reason for our lives. And so it's not about overseeing them, it's about being responsible to them and to one another, and recognizing that we live on an earth that sustains us, that is a part of us, and, you know, we need to be taking care of everything. It's called Namwayut, or all my relations. We are all one. Not that we're all the same, but that everything that we do impacts somebody else. So we need to be mindful of how we show up in the world.
The Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau recently appointed Mary Simon the first Indigenous Governor-General of Canada. This is a largely symbolic position. In fact, the Governor-General represents the Queen, and there's an irony in there as well, of course. I mean, how do you see this? Is this some kind of public relations stunt by Mr. Trudeau?
Well, I know Mary Simon, and she would, even if it is that intention with Mr. Trudeau, she will not show up in that manner. She is a very strong, well-respected leader across the nation, has been for years, and so we're really excited by that, especially because of what you mentioned is the relationship to the Queen. Because Indigenous people saw themselves as sovereign, we actually didn't deal with the Prime Minister or the Canadian government initially. When we were permitted to travel prior to the implementation of these Indian Acts and stuff, we would go straight to the Queen to put our grievances forward. And so having this, I'm hoping actually is an opportunity for Canada to set up a similar post specifically for Indigenous people. So the Governor General and Lieutenant Governors corollary positions with Indigenous people.
You know, as you point out, these laws are still in place, laws like the Indian Act. Is the Canadian government making any effort to change that, to improve conditions for Canada's Indigenous peoples?
I would have to say no. I think Trudeau in particular was elected based on his commitment to reconciliation, and one of the things that he did as a result of that commitment was to appoint Jody Wilson-Raybould as the Attorney General for Canada. And her role really was to look at the Indian Act and find out ways that we could dismantle that and create something that was more equitable for society. And as you know, she was very publicly and very summarily dismissed. And and will, yeah. So no, the government hasn't done anything substantive. They continue to push settling rights and title under their priorities as opposed to the priorities of the people that, the original peoples of the territories.
Karen Joseph, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
To continue our conversation, let's focus on the United States. Joining us now is Chase Iron Eyes. He is at Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota, and he is an attorney to the Lakota People's Law Project. Chase, great to have you with us.
Good morning. Good to be here.
We just heard from Karen Joseph in Canada talking about the serious abuse of Indigenous children in Canada. In fact, that has prompted the Secretary of the Interior here in the United States, Deb Haaland, who is herself Native American, to launch an investigation. These schools were established in the United States as well. In fact, some of them still exist in the United States. What can you tell us about what goes on at these schools?
I think that we are now finding out the depth and the gravity to which the United States and colonial corporate countries like Canada and the United States and other derivations of the British Empire and Western European Christian civilization have hidden from the world, have hidden from the public the depravities, the mass graves, the massacres, and the internal overt policies of countries like the United States and Canada. For some reason right now, our children are unearthing themselves so that we can no longer ignore the genocide, the Holocaust, that is the Indigenous Holocaust of what is now called the Americas. To this day, this has been denied by the occupying countries of our homelands, of our territories. And now, even though the colonial process has caused the Indigenous people to adopt some of the imbalances of the Western Christian metaphysical reality, we are now struggling to come to terms with the truth. Even though the United States is illegally occupying our country because we entered treaties with the United States, they must now recognize the truth. If this country hopes to heal, if this country hopes to reconcile and survive as a nation state, as a republic into the future. It's not just the indigenous genocide and the indigenous Holocaust. It's also the transatlantic slave trade, which brought hundreds of millions of indigenous Africans to our continent. They are also here. They are also willing to rewrite the social contract, the fundamental archetypal agreements that we have with each other as human beings who were taught to call ourselves Americans, who were taught that Native Americans were extinct or that they were vanishing, and certainly that they were erased by all institutions of Western existence. So the truth can no longer be hidden, and we are finding this out in real time.
Chase, you have called for an inquiry and investigation, something modeled along the lines of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You have proposed a Truth and Healing Commission. Are you still pursuing this effort, and how far have you gone with it?
Yes, sir. We are pursuing the effort in terms of President Biden, in terms of Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, who is the first Indigenous woman to hold a cabinet-level position in the government of the occupying United States. To be Indigenous in what is now known as the Americas mean that we have these different identities. And so we are pressing Deb Haaland. She is responding in kind. There is nobody better situated to handle the sheer magnitude of what has happened in this country. She has created the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative, it's known as, and she will begin to study the mass graves, the children's graves that are at these places they call schools. These were not schools. These were torture camps. These are concentration camps where our children, my grandmother, my grandfather, and my mother went through unspeakable horrors at the hands of religious institutions, at the hands of nuns and priests. And so we want the United States to find out the truth, to not withhold the truth from us, from its people. We need to investigate all mass graves, all cemeteries, all records, all internal documents of the Department of the Interior, which still runs some of these boarding schools or residential schools as they are known. The Catholic Church is one of the largest landowners in what is now called the Americas.
Right.
They have done this, and we want the priests and the nuns, some of whom may still be alive. If we can prosecute Nazi war criminals at 90 years old, we can certainly find who did this to our children today.
If we look at the Canadian experience, the Canadian Commission recommended a list of 94 calls to action, if you like, but that was in 2015, and since then only 8 of those actions that they call for have actually been implemented, and they were focused on things like disparities in health, education, and criminal justice. Do you have any specific proposals here with the commission that you are proposing in the United States?
Yes, we are proposing that the church, the Catholic faith-based community, begin to hold itself accountable. The Pope Francis, Pontifex, has yet to fully appreciate what his organization, 1 billion people strong, has instigated against the genocide and the Holocaust that it is responsible for, and that it is still complicit in if it chooses to deny the truth. Being one of the largest and wealthiest landowners of our stolen land here in the Americas, the church needs to give land back to Indigenous peoples, especially in light of the climate crisis that we find ourselves in today. That is not even to mention reparations for the harm and the horror and the ongoing intergenerational trauma that we experience today. I am communicating with the world in the language of my colonizer, of my colonial occupier. So we need to tell the truth in order for there to be a healing. And I fully expect the United States and Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and United States President Biden to be held to an account in this time of reckoning. We didn't choose for our babies to be unearthed, but they are coming to the surface, and with them comes the truth of the last 500 years of illegal subjugation and ongoing political, economic, and juridical subjugation of indigenous nations in our hemisphere. It is illegal. It is not right. What happened during the boarding school and residential school era has transitioned into the taking and placing of Native American children in violation of federal law in the United States. So this process and this has not stopped for us.
Chase, you know, the former United States President Teddy Roosevelt, whom I should add was educated at Harvard University, he once said, this is what he said, "I don't go as far as to say the only good Indian is a dead Indian, but I believe 9 out of every 10 are, and I shouldn't like to inquire too closely about the 10th. Have those kinds of attitudes, in your view, changed in the United States?
Absolutely not. You know, on a large scale, yes, but in the territories, in the parts of this country that overlay on, you know, our traditional homelands, our treaty territory, speaking of the Sioux Nation, the Oceti-Sakowee, there is very much still a violent settler mentality that pervades the political and institutional spheres of states like South Dakota. You have a governor right now who threatened to breach our borders illegally and almost caused an armed conflict in 2019. This is happening. When Donald Trump was the president of the United States, he gave license to this violent settler mentality that expresses itself in the proliferation of white supremacy or the attempted institution of white supremacy, which is crumbling from within. But when those institutions are breathing their last breaths, they will do anything out of their own fear and confusion to preserve those institutions. So that mentality has it's baked into the fabric. It's woven into the fabric of this country. The erasure and genocide of indigenous peoples. I mean, we're the rightful and righteous landowners here. So if I'm a Western civilian, the last thing I want to see is an indigenous person that knows what they are, who they are, and knows that they have superior sovereign rights related to mine as a settler.
Chase, we are going to have to leave it there. Time has caught up with us, but thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you again for inviting me.
And that is all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. Chat with us about this or any other show on Twitter. We're at CGTN America. Or visit us on Facebook. That's at facebook.com/CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.